By the summer of 1914, Europe seemed poised on the brink of war. The peace that had prevailed for the past 30 years on the continent had long been held together by a thin web of diplomacy, trade agreements, and alliances. On June 28th, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, and his wife were assassinated in the streets of Sarajevo, in Bosnia. The Archduke's assassin, a man named Princip, was seeking to gain sovereignty for the tiny Balkan nation that had been swallowed up 6 years earlier by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Over the next month, the diplomatic situation continued to unravel. The death of the Archduke was blamed on Serbia, a sovereign Balkan nation the Austro-Hungarians considered to be agitators. As the empire threatened military action, Russia, with her own designs in the Balkans, began to mobilize troops. Germany, an ally of Austria-Hungary, demanded the Russians to halt her mobilization, and 3 days later issued a proclamation of war against her. Because there existed an alliance between Russia and France, Germany demanded France to define her position in the developing situation. The French agreed to appease the Central Powers by pulling her own troops back 6 miles from the Franco-German border. But Germany, who'd long been looking for a reason to attack, saw this as the opportunity and began moving westwards. On August 2nd, the Kaiser's troops poured into Luxembourg, a tiny nation strategically located at the junction of Germany, France, and Belgium. An attack on France would have to be launched through Belgium, and when that country declared herself neutral and denied passage to the German forces, she too was invaded. Immediately upon the invasion of Belgium, England declared war on Germany. An assassin's bullet in the obscure nation of Sarajevo had set in motion events that would lead to the greatest conflict yet seen on the planet. 5 years later, nearly 10 million people would lie dead in a war that would engulf most of Europe and reach into both Africa and Asia. World War I had begun. The Great War began on the continent to the staccato sound of marching feet. On August 4th, 1914, as troops of the Imperial German Army began flooding into Belgium, it was in accordance with the Schlieffen Plan, a document drawn up in 1905 by the general bearing the same name. Within 6 hours of the initial invasion, some 1.5 million of Kaiser Wilhelm's troops were on the move towards the western frontier. The French, following a plan devised in 1913 by General Joseph Joffre, immediately hurled its 5 armies towards Metz, the ancient fortress city situated east of Verdun. The Joffre plan was a relatively simple one: muster 750,000 men in the eastern corner of France and then drive them over the German border and towards the Rhine. Unfortunately, the French army was woefully short of artillery and remarkably unprepared for the consequences of advancing soldiers across open fields into the face of machine gun fire. Accompanied by the blare of bugles, the French infantry hurled itself again and again against the German guns in a slaughter that claimed 250,000 French casualties in the opening weeks of the war. As the French offensive ground to a halt in Alsace-Lorraine, the German army moved swiftly in the north. The Schlieffen Plan called for the massive wheeling of their forces through Belgium and down into Paris. The small Belgian army, vastly outnumbered and equipped from an earlier time, offered little resistance to the German invaders, who easily overran their positions and continued the drive south into France. British troops and equipment pouring into the port of Ostend managed to check the German advance westwards towards the English Channel, but by the first week of September, the Kaiser's troops stood 30 miles outside of Paris in positions along the Marne River. As the French government fled the capital for the safety of Bordeaux, 120 miles to the south, their army prepared for the battle that would decide France's fate. Paris's huge fleet of buses, delivery trucks, and taxicabs were quickly commandeered to rush every able-bodied soldier to the defense of the city. In what would later be called the Miracle of the Marne, the German army was hurled back from the outskirts of Paris, and their advance finally halted. 4 days after the outbreak of war, the citizens of Dover, England were awakened to the sight of a convoy of trucks rolling through the streets of their seaside town. Less warlike vehicles could hardly be imagined. Hastily requisitioned from the streets of London, they came emblazoned with advertisements for sauces, teas, biscuits, and other popular products of the day. In place of their usual cargoes, they carried a miscellany of canned food, water bottles, small stoves, tents, airplane struts, carburetors, spark plugs, piano wire, and tools of every description. This motley convoy represented the fledgling Royal Flying Corps' first preparations to go to war. On a large grassy plain on the outskirts of town, red flags were being planted along the ditches that bordered the field, even as the first airplanes began to arrive. The hastily erected airdrome would serve as a staging point for RFC Squadrons 2, 3, 4, and 5, preparing to make the cross-channel hop to the continent. The aircraft that would eventually fly to France totaled 37 machines and were a mixed collection of Avros, French-built Henry Farmans and Morane Parasols, and Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2s. While the Avros and Farmans were at best suited for training purposes, the BE-2 was England's most advanced flying machine at the time. Designed by Geoffrey de Havilland, the plane was both frail and heavy but was nevertheless easy to fly and could carry a crew of 2 men at speeds up to 70 miles an hour. The first British squadron to land in France was RFC No. 2, which left the coast in their BE-2s at 6:30 on the morning of August 13 and touched down near Amiens nearly 2 hours later. Squadrons 3 and 4 also flew to France that day, with their contingent of ground personnel, equipment, and supplies arriving on the continent later by trawler. Serving in No. 3 Squadron was mechanic First Class James McCudden, a native of Kent who'd enlisted in the Royal Engineers back in 1910 to serve as a bugler. Following his older brother, he transferred into the Flying Corps in 1913, where he'd been trained as an aircraft mechanic at Farnborough. No. 3 Squadron was equipped with Farmans and Morane Parasols. The slow-moving Farman biplanes were an antique collection of struts and wires nicknamed the Flying Birdcage. The Farman's odd nickname derived from more than just its ungainly appearance. The plane's rigger would sometimes place a sparrow inside the massive wires holding the wings of the plane together, and if the bird managed to escape, it was evidence of a missing wire. When he caught up with the squadron at Amiens, McCudden found the aircrews busy attaching wooden racks along the sides of their parasols. The racks would be used to hold grenades for dropping on the enemy. No. 3 had also received some flechettes, steel darts designed by the French which were intended to rain down on the heads of the German troops. As McCudden observed, the odds against actually hitting someone with one of these darts was unlikely, and even the results would be, at best, dubious. Squadron No. 5 ferried their Moraines and Farmans over to France on August 14th, but one of the pilots, Lieutenant Louis Strange, didn't make the trip until a day later because he'd been complaining of engine troubles. There was in fact nothing wrong with his motor. Strange had spent most of the night attaching a Lewis machine gun to the front cockpit of his Farman, and when he arrived in France the following day, his was the only armed airplane in the Royal Flying Corps. 3 days after their arrival at the front, the pilots and observers of the Royal Flying Corps began their assigned tasks of reconnaissance. Operating at first from their base at Amiens as well as an airfield near Mons in Belgium, they patrolled the entire area of the German advance and were able to provide some valuable information concerning the movements of the enemy. As the German drive progressed during those first weeks of war, the British aircrews found themselves living a nomadic existence in constant retreat ahead of the advancing German army. Still, the catastrophic effect of the German invasion would have been far worsened if not for the information provided from the air during the opening days of the First World War. In Belgium, it had been a flying machine that had spotted the Germans' attempted flanking maneuver around Mons, and as a result, the British Army had staged an effective retreat that had both saved many British lives and halted the German thrust to the Channel. Overnight, a new dimension had been added to the concept of 20th century warfare, and the reconnaissance value of this new tool had immediately proved itself indispensable. It did not take long for the German Air Force to make its presence known either. At the start of the war, the Flieger Troop was able to deploy a total of 180 aircraft along the Western Front, some 60% of which were Taube-type machines. Like their British counterparts, the German airmen concerned themselves primarily with observation duties. In most German aircraft of the day, it was typical that the pilot, often an enlisted man, acted as little more than the chauffeur for the officer-observer who commanded the plane. Unlike the British, however, the generals of the German army remained skeptical of reports filed by their pilots and observers. Schooled in an earlier time and distrustful of these machines to frighten horses, any advantages they might have gained from using these new contraptions went mostly unexploited in those first weeks of the conflict. Most people had assumed that this war would be fought in pretty much the same manner as the previous wars, with massed cavalry charges across open fields, and that the new weaponry being used would at best serve in minor supporting roles. Nothing could be further from the truth. As the French offensive to push the German army back from Paris began to lose momentum, troops on both sides started digging in, and the war began to settle down to the stalemate that would characterize the next 4 years. One such officer who believed the war would be fought on horseback was Manfred von Richthofen. Born in 1892 in the town of Breslau, in the Prussian province of Silesia, von Richthofen had grown up at his family estate, where he'd spent his childhood engaged in athletics, horseback riding, and in what would remain the love for the rest of his days, hunting. Manfred's father, Albrecht von Richthofen, had been a career military officer, serving in the Uhlans, the elite cavalry unit of the army, and rising to the rank of major. The von Richthofens, in fact, had a long history of military service, and it was expected that young Manfred and his brothers would follow in the family tradition. In 1903, at the age of 11, he entered the military academy at Wallstatt, where he would remain for the next 6 years until being accepted into the advanced Kriegsschule outside of Berlin. After receiving his commission in the Uhlans, Lieutenant von Richthofen joined his cavalry unit not far from the family home, where he continued to spend his spare time riding and hunting. On the first day of World War I, von Richthofen found himself leading a patrol across the Prosna River into Russian-occupied Poland. Here was the moment the 22-year-old Manfred had spent half his life preparing for, leading men into the glory of battle. That first patrol turned out to be as peaceful as a ride in the country, with no enemy to be found, but 5 days later the young Uhlhan met with real excitement when he rode his unit into an ambush set up by Russian Cossacks. Although Manfred and his men were able to escape, the young officer learned a valuable lesson on that day, and resolved to never allow himself to be ambushed again. By the end of August, von Richthofen's cavalry unit had been sent to France, where they would carry out reconnoitering duties for the army. At first the work was exciting and fairly dangerous, but as the war ground to a standstill, Manfred quickly found his outfit assigned to tasks more mundane in nature. Although he didn't realize it yet, the days of cavalry charges were gone forever. Before the war was finished, Manfred von Richthofen would find his glory in combat, not on the back of a horse but in the air, and with an airplane serving as his mount. His lifelong training of sports, leadership, and most importantly shooting would combine in such a way that these qualities would make von Richthofen the most famous name in the history of air fighting. For the time being, however, the young Prussian hadn't yet begun thinking about aviation. One young German who was thinking about flying was Oswald Boelcke. Born in 1891 in the province of Saxony, he was one of 6 children whose father, a school teacher, had seen to it that all his children had received a proper education. Against the wishes of his father, Boelcke had decided on a military career, and upon completing school had enlisted as an officer cadet, then transferring to aviation shortly before the outbreak of hostilities. Outgoing and likable, he'd easily passed through the flying school at Halberstadt, where he'd received his flyer certificate by the first week of October. Immediately posted to a combat unit, Boelcke flew 2-seater biplanes assigned to carry out an assortment of duties that mostly entailed reconnaissance and artillery spotting. Before the month was completed, Oswald would be decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class, awarded for observation work performed over the French lines. Another flyer who distinguished himself late in 1914 was Max Immelmann. Immelmann had completed his pilot's training in November and found himself posted to FA-62, the same unit Boelcke was serving in. A year older than Boelcke, Immelmann was born the son of a wealthy factory owner in the city of Dresden and had studied mechanical engineering before enlisting in the armed forces. Because of his love for machines, it was only natural that he'd applied for transfer to the aviation branch, where, along with Boelcke, he'd quickly established himself as one of his unit's top scouting pilots. Both Immelmann and Boelcke would soon become names forever associated with the greatest flyers of the First World War, especially Boelcke, who would eventually pen his famous dicta, a set of rules and fighter tactics that would come to be adopted by pilots of every nation. For the time being, though, both these men would continue with their observation duties, as the weapon that would lead them to fame had not yet been invented. When occasionally it would happen that enemy aircraft met in the air, the event would usually be observed with a friendly wave exchanged between crews. The enemy were, after all, fellow airmen, and whether the machine carried a cross or a roundel on its wings was chiefly a matter of politics. It did not take long to realize, however, that depriving the enemy of their ability to gather information from the air would render a tremendous advantage to either side, and so observers began carrying pistols and rifles aloft. If this turn of event had taken on a rather unfriendlier tone, it had not created any threat to be taken seriously. To be sure, planes were returning to their home bases with the odd bullet hole in the wings or fuselage, but beyond that, aircrews generally went about their work undisturbed. A machine gun, mounted for the use of the observer, seemed to be the obvious solution to the problem, but as of yet no adequate weapon existed. Lieutenant Strange, the pilot who'd arrived in France with a machine gun mounted on his airplane, had quickly discarded the weapon. The added weight had bogged down the performance of his Farman to the point that he'd been unable to catch up and maneuver on any German planes. Still, to everyone involved, it was understood that a proper weapon would be needed for the air crews, and so both sides were working at developing lighter machine guns. The first weapons being affixed to planes were basically modified versions of the guns being used by the soldiers on the ground. The French began experimenting with the Hotchkiss gun, while the British armed some of its planes with the Lewis, an air-cooled weapon that took its feed from a magazine carousel. Neither of these machine guns were particularly well suited for aircraft, being heavy and prone to frequent stoppages. There was also considerable interest in developing the airplane as a weapon to drop bombs. In the opening weeks of the war, German Zeppelins had been used to drop bombs on targets in Belgium and France. Although they did manage to kill some civilians, the raids had caused little damage to any military targets, and 3 of the attacking airships had been destroyed by ground fire. For bombs, the raiders had used artillery shells with their noses weighted, but most of them had failed to explode on impact. It was not an encouraging start for the Zeppelins at war. The first bombing raids with aircraft were carried out by the Royal Naval Air Service. In Great Britain, the Sopwith Aviation Company had unveiled the Tabloid, a single-place scouting machine based on a pre-war racing design. Sturdy and easy to fly, the Tabloid could reach a speed of 90 miles an hour and stay aloft for 3 hours. It was the first in an excellent line of aircraft that would culminate 4 years later with the Sopwith Snipe. On September 22nd, a Royal Naval flight of 4 tabloids had been sent from their base in Antwerp to bomb the Zeppelin sheds in Dusseldorf. Only one machine, piloted by Flight Lieutenant R.L.G. Marix, had managed to make the 100-mile flight to the German target. After circling once over the huge hangars used to house the dirigibles, Marix had tossed his 2 20-pound bombs over the side of his plane and immediately been rewarded when one of the sheds went up in a fireball. The L-9, a brand new airship, was destroyed, and the British pilot flew home with the knowledge that another military use for the airplane had been confirmed. The first air-to-air victory had occurred during October, when the French pilot, Joseph France, and his mechanic observer, Louis Quinault, came upon a German biplane over the town of Reims. France and Quinault were flying in a Voisin, a sturdy pusher-type machine where the observer and pilot sat in a nacelle at the front of the plane. Quinault had mounted a Hotchkiss gun, stripped of its heavy cooling skirt, on a tripod in the front cockpit, and they'd spent 2 weeks trying to catch an enemy machine. On the 15th, they finally did meet up with an unarmed German two-seater, probably an Aviatik. They'd maneuvered in close a couple of times and proceeded to empty 2 clips of ammunition into it, before it had rolled over onto its back and plunged into the ground. Within days, France had been awarded the Legion d'Honneur, and Quinault bestowed with the Médaille Militaire. In 1916, France would go on to become the chief test pilot for the Voisin Company, and, surviving the war, continued flying well into his 70s. If a chance meeting with an enemy in the air presented little threat, flying was still a dangerous business. Aircraft and crews were being lost, both by enemy fire and in accidents. Planes were occasionally being brought down by ground fire. To soldiers looking up as these fragile machines passed overhead, the opportunity to pot away at them was irresistible, and if the pilot or some vital part of the engine could be hit, it was a good chance the craft would fall. By the end of the year, anti-aircraft batteries, at first machine guns and then later explosive shells, were being deployed along the front. Airplanes were often poorly marked, and it was not an uncommon occurrence for them to be fired upon by overzealous friendly forces. Accidents were by far claiming the highest number of flying casualties. Virtually all the aircraft serving were of pre-war designs, and the rigors of daily flying rapidly began to take its toll on these flimsy machines. Motors failed, undercarriages collapsed, and wings buckled with alarming regularity. The air crews found themselves operating from makeshift fields, often unsuitable for the demands required in aviation, and takeoff and landing accidents were commonplace. On both sides of the lines, engineers and designers were scrambling to improve the reliability and performance of their airplanes. Before the end of the year, some new types had been introduced and hurried to the front. The British and Colonial Airplane Company unveiled the Bristol Scout, a trim single-seat biplane of surprisingly modern design. With a top speed of nearly 100 miles per hour, the Bristol was ahead of its time, and could have been a first-class fighting machine except for the fact that there was no way to effectively arm it. The Bristols would remain in frontline service until the end of the following year, when they would be relegated to a training role. The German aircraft makers offered improved versions of their Albatros, Aviatik, DFW, and Rumpler two-seaters, while the French were able to introduce more advanced models of their Farmans and Voisins. In Great Britain, a camera had been designed for aerial photography. The Flying Corps had assigned 3 of its officers to the task of creating a new photographic unit. Working closely with the Thornton Pickard Manufacturing Company, a camera had been developed that could take decent pictures from the air and have its film be quickly processed in the field. In the coming year, as the ground war dragged on, photographs taken above the front lines would prove invaluable. As 1914 drew to a close, troops on both sides hunkered down in the trenches facing each other across a no-man's land that extended from the Swiss border to the English Channel. Massed machine guns and miles of barbed wire made sure that nobody was going anywhere too quickly, while artillery fire made it remarkably unpleasant to sit still. During that first dreadful winter of the war, more soldiers in the trenches would die by pneumonia than by bullets or bombs. While the Western Front lay frozen and under snow, the generals occupied themselves with drafting plans for springtime offensives. Everyone seemed resolved to the fact that the war would continue for another year, and so it was that 1915 would see some of the bloodiest fighting in the history of mankind. With the spring thaw came the first Allied offensive of 1915. Beginning on March 10th, the First Army of the British Expeditionary Force, under the command of General Douglas Haig, began its assault on the town of Neuve-Chapelle in northwestern France. The attack had originally been planned as part of a wider offensive in the Artois region, but when large numbers of the British troops were diverted to Turkey to take part in the campaign on the Gallipoli Peninsula, it was decided to go ahead and carry out the attack with the more modest objective of reducing the small German salient immediately east of Lille. The battle began with 350 British guns unleashing a half-hour-long bombardment along a 2-kilometer stretch of the line. RFC crews sent aloft using wireless radios and Morse code to direct the artillery fire played no small measure in the success of the barrage, and 40,000 British and Indian soldiers of the First Army rapidly broke through the German lines and captured Neuve-Chapelle. When the battle ended on March 13th, it had cost the Allied command some 13,000 men to regain 2 kilometers of land originally lost in October of 1914. German losses were roughly the same. On the day World War I began, a French aviator named Roland Garros had found himself in the awkward position of being stranded in Berlin. Garros had been one of the more famous names from the early days of flying. After seeing the Brazilian pioneer Santos Dumont demonstrate his 14 bis outside of Paris, Garros had abandoned his studies in classical music and taken up flying. By 1911, he'd set the world's altitude record, been the first man to fly across the Mediterranean, and then had spent the next 3 years performing exhibition flights that had taken him all over the European continent and even to America. And so, in August 1914, while German troops were pouring into Belgium, the Frenchman sat under house arrest in his Berlin hotel room. Faced with the prospect of internment, Garros had simply climbed out a bathroom window in the middle of the night and walked to the exhibition field where his airplane sat. After stowing a couple of gasoline cans on board, he'd taken off into the darkness and flown himself home. Back in Paris, Garros immediately reported for service and was attached to Escadrille MS No. 23, a squadron whose personnel included many of France's most famous pre-war flyers. Garros was a welcome addition to the group. MS No. 23 followed the French system of designating its squadrons. the MS standing for Marine Salner, the type of aircraft the group flew. Escadrille 23 flew the Type N, a single-seat monoplane powered by an 80-horsepower Gnome rotary engine. Although the plane was one of the best-performing machines at the time, it was hampered by its lack of armament. The French had begun experimenting with their Nieuport biplanes, mounting a Lewis gun on the top wing to fire over the arc of the propeller. This arrangement did show some promise, but it also presented its own set of problems. It would be both difficult to aim and even harder to reload in flight. With the monoplane Gyros flew, there was no way to mount a gun, and he'd grown increasingly frustrated with his inability to fire at the Germans he was encountering over the front. Time after time, he'd flown up directly behind the unarmed enemy two-seaters and could only sit and watch through the seemingly invisible disc of his propeller. The idea occurred to Gyros that if a machine gun were fired directly through the spinning propeller, most of the bullets would miss it, but not all of them, and the propeller would ultimately be shot away. Could it be reinforced in some way to withstand those bullets that would inevitably strike it? Gyros took his idea to the aircraft designer Robert Salner, and in March of 1915 returned to his escadrille with a brand new Type N machine boasting a pair of important modifications. One of these modifications was a Hotchkiss machine gun, mounted directly in front of the pilot. The other was a pair of steel deflection wedges bolted to the section of the propeller where the bullets would strike. In tests on the ground, the idea had basically worked. The propeller remained intact, but they quickly realized that the unpredictable nature of the ricocheting bullets would be an ongoing concern. It was on April Fool's Day when Gyros finally got to test his new weapon in battle. He'd caught up with a flight of 4 Albatros two-seaters above the French lines, and had quickly maneuvered himself into position on the tail of the rearmost machine. One can only imagine the astonishment of the German observer's face when a burst of machine gun fire blossomed from behind the spinning arc of the Frenchman's propeller and slammed into the Albatross, killing the pilot and leaving the machine to careen towards the ground below. Gyros quickly latched onto the tail of a second ship, which after receiving a short burst from his gun, caught fire and fell earthwards, incinerating its horrified crew. The surviving 2 German planes raced for home, their crews pale and unnerved over what they'd just witnessed. Over the next 18 days, Gyros destroyed 3 more German airplanes. The psychological effect that this lone French monoplane had on the enemy flyers at the front was immense. German crews were terrified with the prospect of encountering this new weapon, and began fleeing at the sight of any Allied single-seater. Gyros, already somewhat of a household name in his country, was lauded in all the papers, declaring him an ace. Indeed, following the example set by Roland Garros, the feat of downing 5 enemy airplanes would forever after bestow upon a flyer the status of ace. On the German side of the lines, there was much speculation about this new secret weapon the German air crews were suddenly facing. The secret was revealed on April 19th, when Gyros was forced to land behind the lines with a failed engine. He'd been sent to bomb the railroad siding at Courtrai when his motor had quit, and once on the ground had been unable to burn his machine before being taken captive. And so the Germans now knew how their airplanes were being shot down, and this knowledge would lead to the next great technological advance in aerial combat. 2.5 years later, when Roland Garros was to finally escape from a German prison camp and rejoin the fighting, it was to a very different world he returned, due in no small part to events he himself had set in motion. On April 22nd, the German army launched an offensive to capture the town of Ypres in the northwestern corner of France. This would be their only major attack on the Western Front in 1915. The Second Battle of Ypres opened with a brief artillery bombardment delivered by howitzers, which was then quickly followed up by a new weapon the Germans were testing, chlorine gas. Canisters containing 168 tons of the poison were released at sunrise, and a veil of the yellow-greenish mist could soon be seen rolling across no man's land towards the French trenches. The effect of the gas attack was immediate. Within the first 10 minutes of the attack, some 5,000 Allied troops were dead due to asphyxiation, with another 5,000 men left blind. As the German troops advanced, wearing primitive respirators, they found the forward trenches deserted from where the mostly Algerian and other colonial troops had fled in terror. So surprised were the Germans with the effectiveness of this terrible new weapon that they were unprepared to exploit the gains they could have made on that first day of the battle. The Allies were able to shore up their defenses with an influx of British troops, and the German advance was halted after 3 kilometers. The battle was to continue right on up until the end of May, and the Germans, unable to accomplish their original goal of capturing Ypres, eventually settled on the plan of reducing the town to rubble through artillery bombardment. Air crews from both sides were in abundance throughout the battle, and a report filed by Lieutenant W.B. Rhodes Morehouse of No. 2 Squadron had been instrumental in securing a victory for the British over a concentration of German troops found moving up to the front. Unfortunately, in gathering the information needed, Rhodes Morehouse had been forced to fly so low over the enemy positions that he had sustained multiple wounds from ground fire. Although he did return to his home base with both his airplane and the information, he died the following day of his injuries. For his valor, Rhodes Morehouse was posthumously awarded Great Britain's highest honor, the Victoria Cross. It had generally been assumed that the first German airships would be deployed against England, and by the time of the first Zeppelin raids in January of 1915, German propaganda had made the British population nervous with their boasts that they would bomb England into submission. The first such raids were carried out on the night of January 19th, when the L-3 and L-4 dropped 15 or so high-explosive bombs on and around Yarmouth. The results were less than impressive, with 4 civilians killed and a railway power station hit, but the British government, feeling the need for improved home defense, began installing searchlights and guns around their key cities in southeastern England. London was bombed for the first time in early May, and again, no significant damage was reported. In the following months, more raids against London were attempted by the German giants, but these had, at best, a psychological effect on the English population and no real military value. On the night of June 6th, LZs 37, 38, and 39 took off from the Zeppelin base at Avere, Belgium, and set out for the trip to London. After barely heading out to sea, LZ-38 developed engine troubles and returned to its home shed. At about the same time the airships had lit out for their night's attack, several British aircraft of the Royal Naval Air Service had been dispatched to bomb the Zeppelin sheds at Avere and St. Agathe. LZ-38 was destroyed in its shed when Flight Lieutenant J.P. Wilson scored a direct hit after dropping 3 65-pound bombs from his Henry Farman biplane. Another British pilot, Sub-Lieutenant Reginald Warneford, and a Marine Parasol, abandoned his plans to bomb the sheds at St. Agathe when he stumbled upon LZ-37 cruising in the fog above the coastal town of Ostend. For 3/4 of an hour, Warneford stalked the German giant, straining to gain the advantage of height over his adversary. When he finally obtained a position from which to carry out his attack, Warneford traversed the length of the Zeppelin and released his 6 20-pound bombs. 150 feet below the Englishman, the dirigible erupted in a great explosion that nearly tossed the Parasol from the air. The roaring metallic inferno fell earthwards, spilling men and equipment before crashing to the ground, a mass of twisted and blackened girders. Only one crewman survived the destruction of LZ-37 after he fell through the roof of a convent and landed in a nun's bed. The loss of the 2 airships that night was the cause of much dissertation amongst the Zeppelin commanders, and as a result the forward bases were abandoned and the remaining airships relocated to northern Germany. The High Command, still believing that raids against Great Britain would prove to have strategic value, stepped up its pressure for more attacks against the enemy homeland, and ordered the Chief of Naval Airships, Captain Peter Strasser, to continue his bombing missions. And so, for the time being, the Zeppelin attacks on England would continue. Manfred von Richthofen, the young cavalry officer, had grown more and more frustrated with his duties at the Western Front. The glory that must surely accompany leading men into battle now seemed a remote concept, as he was daily saddled with increasing administrative duties. The war had ground to a great stalemate, and von Richthofen realized that aviation offered an escape from the boredom that had become his career. In a letter to his commanding officer requesting a transfer, Richthofen had written that he did not go to war to gather cheese and eggs, but for another purpose, and at the end of May he was officially reassigned to the Flieger Troop. Rapidly passing through the observer's course at the aviation school in Cologne, von Richthofen was assigned to Fliegerabteilung 69, a reconnaissance squadron flying two-seat Albatros machines on the Russian front. The Albatros B-2 was an adequate machine, but not particularly well suited for observation work, as the observer sat in the front seat and had to peer out through a mass of struts and wires between the wings. Richthofen's pilot, Lieutenant Georg Zoomer, shared the young Prussian's thirst for adventure, and the pair provided some of the best reports to come back from over the lines. They routinely flew extremely low and daringly over enemy installations to get the information they needed. Zoomer was in fact stricken with tuberculosis, and knowing that his days on Earth were limited, his reckless attitude made him an ideal combat pilot. When Zoomer was transferred to the Western Front, von Richthofen was paired with a new pilot, Erich Count von Holk, a flyer of exceptional abilities who was far less reckless than Zoomer, but no less brave. Von Richthofen was to fly with Count von Holk until August of 1915, when he himself received a posting to a bombing squadron stationed at Ostend, in Belgium. The new unit was equipped with large twin-engine AEG machines, capable of carrying 400 pounds of bombs. To von Richthofen's surprise, he was reunited with his old flying comrade, Georg Zoomer, also stationed at Ostend, and their partnership was immediately resumed. At the outbreak of the World War, few men would have seemed less likely to achieve eternal glory than George Guynemer. When he turned up at a French military recruiting station in August of 1914, he was all of 19 years old, but looked 15. Thin to the point of frailty, Guynemer had spent much of his childhood bedridden with illnesses, and once war began had been turned down 4 times by the French army before finally being accepted as an apprentice airplane mechanic. Determined to fly, the young recruit had charmed and pestered the pilots stationed at Po Aerodrome for lessons, and on March 10th, Guynemer made his solo in a Moraine Parasol. Assigned to a military flying school, he finally returned to the front on June 8th with a pair of corporal chevrons sewn on his sleeves and a posting to Escadrille MS No. 3 under the command of Captain Felix Brocard. Brocard was a capable leader and a man of great patience, but when Guynemer rode off 2 of the squadron's parasols in his first week of operational flying, both through clumsy landings, Brocard was tempted to ground the young pilot for good. Given a 2-week probation, Guynemer had no more such mishaps and was soon performing regular reconnaissance work with his observer, Sergeant Gerder. On July 19th, the pair attacked an Albatros 2-seater over Soissons, and while Guynemer coolly held a course alongside the enemy plane, Gerder emptied a drum of ammunition from his Lewis gun into it. The German machine crashed in flames, and both the Frenchmen were awarded the Médaille Militaire for the feat. Although not a fighter squadron, the pilots were still shooting down the occasional German machine, and the reputation of Brocard's escadrille was growing. As a result, MS No. 3 was assigned a variety of special missions, many of which Guynemer volunteered for. On more than one occasion, he was to land behind the German lines under the cover of night, with the job of delivering a French spy to a deserted field. This was considered a very dangerous assignment, and the feat of simply landing and taking off again in the darkness would require a great deal of skill, concentration, and courage. At this early stage in his career, George Guynemer was already showing considerable amounts of these properties. Leno Hawker was an Englishman who'd been flying continuously since 1910, when he joined the Royal Aero Club to take private lessons. After receiving his commission in the RFC, he arrived in France in the opening days of the war and had carried out an assortment of flying duties with a variety of aircraft in use by No. 6 Squadron. In May of 1915, the squadron was equipped with several of the small Bristol Scouts, an airplane Hawker immediately fell in love with. Designing his own mounting system to get a Lewis gun up above the top wing, Hawker had one of the few fighters serving in the Flying Corps at the time. On July 25th, Hawker set out alone in the early evening to patrol the area between Passchendaele and Ypres. In separate encounters over the space of 90 minutes, he was to send 3 German aircraft to their destruction, the last one falling in flames and witnessed by thousands of troops on the ground below. A month later, when presented with the Victoria Cross, Hawker was already an ace with 5 confirmed victories. Leno Hawker had become the first famous British flyer of the war, and on the home front the papers carried the stories of his thrilling exploits in the air. 16 months later, his name would become well known to the Germans when he would meet his rendezvous with Manfred von Richthofen in what would be one of the most celebrated aerial duels of the war. By mid-July, FA-62 had received its allotment of 2 Fokker Eindeckers, which were assigned to the squadron's 2 best pilots, Oswald Boelcke and Max Immelmann. On August 1st, both flyers were scrambled aloft to give chase to a flight of 10 British BE-2s that had just dropped bombs on their airfield at Douai. When they caught up with the English 2-seaters near Arras, they immediately pounced on the rearmost machines, and although Boelcke was put out of the fight when his machine gun jammed, Immelmann pressed home his attack. After pumping nearly 450 rounds into one of the bombers, it went down in a steep glide and came to rest in a field. Following the British machine down, Immelmann landed alongside his first victory and promptly took its pilot, Lieutenant Reed, of RFC No. 2 Squadron, prisoner. Upon examining the downed BE-2, Immelmann counted 40 bullet holes. The victory had hardly been a case of either advanced tactics or great marksmanship, and the Dresden native immediately went to work on improving his performance in both these areas. 2 weeks later, Oswald Boelcke scored his first victory in a 9-decker, when he shot down a Bristol scout on his own side of the lines. In mid-August, the Allies launched their Greater Artois campaign, along a broad front that included offensives at Loos, Vimy Ridge, Arras, and Champagne. This was to be the largest Allied offensive of the year, with British and French airplanes kept busy working on the German side of the lines. For the new Fokker Eindecker pilots, it was a great opportunity to refine their tactics in the air. Max Immelmann devised a maneuver that would allow him to rapidly change the direction of his aircraft without sacrificing height. After making a diving pass on a foe, he would pull his plane up as though performing a loop, but instead of continuing through the arc, would roll out at the top and suddenly be flying at the same level in the opposite direction. Even today, this maneuver is known as the Immelmann roll. No flyer was working harder to pioneer techniques in aerial fighting than Oswald Boelcke, and his tactics would eventually come to be adopted by Jagdflieger, or hunter pilots, the world over. Boelcke applied a methodical approach to the problem that included equal parts trial, error, and theory. One of Boelcke's conclusions was that attacks against enemy planes should always be conducted from behind the enemy and with the advantage of height. Whenever possible, he maintained, attacks should be carried out with the sun to one's back. It was a simple but effective rule to be followed, and by the end of the year, posters began appearing in Royal Flying Corps mess halls, reminding the British crews to beware of the Hun in the sun. Through the autumn of 1915, both Boelcke and Immelmann continued to refine their tactics, and by the time the year drew to a close, they had each achieved ace status, having shot down 5 aircraft apiece. Boelcke had by now been transferred to a squadron stationed in Metz, and in October he shot down a French Voisin that had been sent to bomb the city's railway station. This victory was won just as the Kaiser himself was arriving by train, and the story of this combat was widely circulated in the German newspapers. Boelcke and Immelmann were fast becoming rising stars in the eyes of the German public. In September, Escadrille Moraine-Salner No. 3, commanded by Captain Brocard, was redesignated Escadrille Nieuport No. 3, when the squadron was re-equipped with the newest French scouting plane, the Nieuport 11. Called the Baby because of its tiny size, with a wingspan of a scant 24 feet, the Nieuport was a remarkably nimble little machine that could reach a speed of nearly 100 miles per hour. Much to the joy of the pilots assigned to No. 3 Squadron, was the fact that the Newport Baby also came equipped with a Lewis machine gun mounted on the upper wing to fire over the propeller. After nearly a year of serving in the slower-moving two-seat parasols, the French pilots finally had been supplied with a machine truly designed for fighting. The Newport 11 carried only a pilot, and after the squadron's observers were reassigned to other frontline units, Newport No. 3 was reclassified as a chase escadrille, a pursuit squadron. Shortly after receiving the new airplanes, the squadron began painting storks on the side of each machine, and the unit was ever after known as Les Seconds, the Storks. Over time, Les Seconds would become the most celebrated squadron in France, eventually becoming a chase group composed of 4 separate escadrilles. With the re-equipping of the squadron, Felix Brocard had been given a free hand to begin gathering his country's best pilots to serve under his command. For a flyer to be assigned to the Storks quickly became a high honor. George Ginemeer took to the Newport Baby with remarkable ease. Here was an airplane that seemed designed specifically for this frail young man. Ginemeer, who'd already possessed a gifted touch at the controls of the old Moraine Salners, virtually became one with the new craft, and he immediately went to work proving the Newport in combat. In early December, he scored his first victory flying the new plane. Unfortunately, because he'd been prowling alone far behind the German lines, he wouldn't receive official credit for the kill. The French Army's strict rules of confirmation demanded that an observer in the air or on the ground must witness the victory for the pilot's claim to be accepted. Undaunted, Ginemeer continued his hunting and brought down not 1, but 2 German machines the following week. This time, both victories were fully observed by the French soldiers on the ground. By Christmas Eve, Ginemeer's 21st birthday, he was awarded with the Cross of the Legion of Honor, one of his nation's highest medals. The attached citation hailed him as a pilot of great gallantry, a model of devotion to duty and courage. As 1915 drew to a close, it was obvious to everyone concerned that there would be no quick ending to the conflict at hand. The great Allied offensives above the Somme and in the Champagne region had ended in failure, and the war remained a stalemate. The millions of men lining the trenches along the shattered muddy landscape that made up the Western Front were faced only with miserable prospects as the war prepared to enter its 3rd year. Even on the quiet days, no fewer than 1,000 men were killed, hit by stray artillery shells fired by bored gunners or picked off by snipers in the far trenches. All these deaths accomplished absolutely nothing. One area in which the Allied effort had shown progress was their naval blockade of the German Empire. Britain, with her superior navy, had effectively closed Germany's northern ports, and Germany was beginning to feel the pinch as the flow of incoming war materials slowed. Realizing that the situation would only grow worse over time, the German generals decided that a concentrated massed blow against the French could conceivably bring them to victory in 1916, but it would have to happen soon. On the Eastern Front, the recent collapse of the Russian army had suddenly made available an additional 1 million of the Kaiser's troops to use against the French forces. The German plan, drawn up by General Erich von Falkenhayn, a Prussian career officer, would rely not on strategic planning and tactical surprise, but rather on brute force and attrition. As Christmas of 1915 passed and gave way to the new year, plans were finalized and the might of the Imperial Army began moving into position against what would forever be known as mankind's greatest success in truly creating a hell on earth. The name of this slaughterhouse, situated on the Meuse River, some 50 miles to the northeast of Reims, was to be Verdun.